presidential race in Russia, a question of legitimacy and international recognition. These upcoming presidential elections have been challenged already by international organizations in the past. So the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe formulated already in October 2023 that the legitimacy of these elections will be under question, mostly because of a questionable right to stand for candidate, but also because of other reasons. And also the European Parliament in its February resolution from February 2024 raised the question of legitimacy of these elections. So it is lots of concerns and lots of concerns for these upcoming elections, and it's good reasons to have an expert discussion on the question of legitimacy of these elections. My name is Stefanie Schiffer. I'm the chair of the board of the European Platform for Democratic Elections. We are a network of 16 citizen election observers in Europe, and we are glad that Olga Ivazovskaya is here. She's the chair of the board of ODIHR, our Ukrainian member organization. We have EPD has been declared an undesirable organization by the Russian Ministry of Justice in 2018. So this is a reason we have no Russian voice here. This would be impossible by Russian law to attend such a discussion from the EPD. I briefly introduce our speakers. As I said, Olga Ivazovskaya is here. She's the chair of board of the civil network ODIHR. She's also chair of a global network of domestic election monitors, the GNDM. She has been a member of a trilateral contact group, the Minsk group, from 2016 to 2018. And with the full-scale invasion of the Russian military to Ukraine, she was initiator of a Center for Ukrainian Victory, where she advocates special tribunal, and the center is collecting data on the war crimes committed by Russian military in Ukraine. Thank you very much, Olga, for being here with this very important background, which is important knowledge and expertise for this discussion we have ahead. Alexander Schlick is an independent election expert. He has been election advisor since 2010 for ODIHR, the election department. After that, Alex Schlick has been election expert with the team Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. He is Belarusian from background, now situated living in Warsaw. And he is the author of a recent policy paper of the EPD on the legitimacy of these presidential elections in Russia. Thank you, Alex, for being here. We have a third expert, his name Jan Dolbaum. Thank you very much for being with us today. You are replacing Margarita Zavatskaya. She could not make it, unfortunately, but she was nice to recommend you. You have been working together before, Jan, with Margarita. You are a researcher at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. You have also been working for Bremen University, and your field of expertise is elections in Russia. So we're happy to have you with us. We do not see you very well, but people may guess a little bit. If you can change a little bit lighting, maybe it would be helpful. So we have prepared a series of questions around the legitimacy of elections for the expert. First, Olga, first question goes to you. Your initiative was one of the first civil society organizations raising concerns about the legitimacy of the upcoming presidential elections, and we ask you to explain us in brief what have been your main arguments, what are your main points of concerns. Do you think these elections devote international recognition? If not, why not? Please, Olga.
Thank you, colleagues, Stephanie, and I hope that we will have honest discussion about the situation in Russia, because we can't name it this process as election. It's sham election, as we named the sham referendum, which was happening a few times on occupied territories on Ukraine, but organized by Russia. So first of all, Vladimir Putin has officially been the president of the Russian Federation for 20 years. And taking into account Putin's term as a prime minister, the latter has been ruling the Russian Federation for about 26 years. And he can stay in the Kremlin till 2036. So it will be 40 years in power. In 2008, the presidential term was increased from 4 to 6 years to reduce elections and as a result limit the ability of citizens to change the government. In 2020, Putin was allowed to run for 2 more elections. And it worth noting that the latest constitutional changes are purely individual. The powers of other presidents after Putin will be limited to 2 years, 2 terms in total, and not in a row unless the Russian authorities will traditionally authoritarian leadership to do not change the constitution again. In the report on terms limit part 1 president, the Venice Commission emphasized that in presidential and semi-presidential systems, term limits of the president is a factor that perpetrates the danger of abuse of power by the head of executive power. The Economist last year noted that in their report that Russia recorded the most significant decline in democracy of any other worldwide, dropping 22 places to 146 place. This was due to the state's firm control over the media and the suppression of anti-war protests. Therefore, the political regime in Russia is defined as stable authoritarian, but it was before the last tragic cases what happened in Russia. So no political competition at all this year. Putin's political opponents, such as Alexei Navalny, first, he was in prison, he was jailed, and then killed. Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Garry Kasparov in exile, Boris Nemtsov killed, and others were eliminated earlier. So, paragraph 13 of the report of international recognized status of election observers emphasized that many new democracies were born on previous authoritarian or totalitarian regimes, where elections were well known but were not an instrument of freedom and the strengthening of oppression and political domination. The conclusion of the Venice Commission Convention on Electoral Standards, Electoral Rights and Freedom states that the right to vote is well known, but the functioning of the entire system may be undemocratic. The emphasis is not so much on voting as on elections in general. Of course, democratic elections require universal, free, secret, direct, and equal voting. However, it is not enough. Without true pluralism, multi-partyism, freedom not to participate without observers, voting can be seen as useless in democratic terms. Elections can be fraudulent. So I have to highlight that elections, which is happening in Russia, has to be named in an honest manner. It is sham or fake elections, which is happening without competition, without freedoms and rights. And it doesn't even matter so much that this election happening during so many terms, because I believe that competition was stopped in 2012, but it's happening on occupied territories of Ukraine, on the territories of Russia without any freedoms. That's why, let's speak honestly, President Putin will not have any legitimacy after the end of this process, because President Putin is going to stay in power for 40 years, continue aggression against Ukraine, and continue using semi-rules or semi-processes as so-called elections in Russia just for having legitimacy for those who are accepting the double standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. You mentioned a whole series of points and important concerns on these elections, and a very crucial one, a central one, which is the change of a character of elections from real elections with a real intention for competition to a pure imitation, willing imitation of a procedure without substance. So these are very valid and important points. I just give a word forward. Jan, ask you to add from your point of view. We have in our discussions two angles, I would say, where we look on this, what is going on, a political, an analyst, and an analytical angle, and an angle from the point of election observation and election techniques. And this is also the composition of our honored speakers today. So I would ask you, from your point of view of political history and analysis, to maybe add and comment on the points that Olga made.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks also for having me here. I do think that elections serve various purposes. Obviously, in Russia these days, elections do not serve the purpose of selecting the leader, the political leader, or the highest political office in a competitive fashion. I think that is very clear. And I think that was clear for quite some time. For the regime, of course, the elections still serve an important purpose nonetheless. So they are a means to impress, first and foremost, I think, and a means to send a signal to the ruling elite that Putin is in power and that he can conduct this election in a victorious manner without any opposition, without any scandals and any protests, and use that as a sign to be sent to everybody who might harbor a little thought about maybe challenging him, that he actually has the means to dominate the whole political scene. I think that's the most important function that this election serves from the perspective of the regime. It's also, of course, authoritarian elections. You know, this might be a contradiction in terms, right? Because authoritarianism is characterized by non-democratic means, right? That's kind of the definition, a negative definition of authoritarianism. But still, authoritarian regimes do have elections, even if these elections are not democratic, right? And these elections function very differently, and they have different purposes. One purpose I've already outlined, and there are other purposes, for example, to gather information, right? About regions where maybe people are more dissatisfied and try to express that during their vote, and then perhaps look a little closer at these regions and try to either repress that dissent or do something about it in a different way. So it's a tool for gathering information, especially in situations in which the media doesn't really fulfill that function because it's state controlled, right, or it is censored. Then it also has the function to co-opt parts of the opposition to, for example, we'll still see this is formally a multi-party election, even though the opposition parties are obviously not opposition forces, but they are parts of the regime, of the wider regime. But these opposition parties are kind of included in the governing mechanism, and they get something out of it. And that's also an important mechanism that authoritarian regimes use to control society, right? So when asking, is there a point to these elections? Yes, there is from the perspective of the regime, very much so. And the question is, of course, what does that mean to us, right? And I do agree that these elections will not give Putin any legitimacy. Obviously, they will just show that he's able to orchestrate the process. The question is, though, does that automatically mean that the West or whoever should not recognize the result of these elections? I think these are two separate questions, right? I'm totally on board with saying they don't show any legitimacy. I think it's still, but this is not automatically, I think, in my opinion, it doesn't automatically mean that we shouldn't recognize the result of them. And we can discuss that, I think, in the second round. But I would now, I just want to flag that I think analytically these are two separate questions. right? Whether they bestow legitimacy on the regime and whether that means something for us. And I think I'll leave it at this point.
Thank you, Jan. You raised already the question about political implication of recognition or non-recognition, and you saying that you don't think the consequences of a recognition or non-recognition. I think we should discuss it further. And you point also to the role that Putin designs to the West and to the international audience in that. And I think this is something we should really reflect on. What would it mean if the elections would be recognized without limitations? This is a very important question. We come to that later. Thank you. And you yeah, because you raised this important question. I would now ask Alex maybe to come back to the question of election procedures. Jan mentioned authoritarian elections happen. Not all authoritarian elections are not recognized. This would be also those in the OSCE regions. The non-recognition of these elections would be an exemption, a new situation, almost new every yeah. So I would ask you, Alex, from the point of view of election procedures, please to summarize your findings on the procedures as they have happened so far. And what would that mean for a question of recognition or non-recognition? Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Stephanie. It is a pleasure to be here. And I will inevitably be going back to the study that was published by the PDE a couple of days ago in my remarks. And I do want to touch on the procedures, but I do want to address a couple of points that have already been raised by Olha and also by Jan. First is I do see and I agree fully with Olha that we cannot characterize these elections as elections. These are a sham, these are a theater, these are a farce, anything but an election. And those are all very good ways to qualify this process in the political terms, in the communications terms. But I think that we would want to use also, not instead, but also the terms that are of a legal nature to have a discussion on the recognition or not recognition of the elections and the possible consequences in this regard. And this is where I would want to address what Jan has just mentioned as well, and what you've started this discussion from, Stephanie. The topic of recognizing or not recognizing the elections is an important one because it's not an automatic procedure. There is no such thing as an on or off switch. Ultimately, it is a political decision. And you're right, Stephanie, not all sham elections, not all terrible elections inevitably lead to a political or legal declaration of we do not recognize these elections. There are cases when everybody understands that the elections are an absolute disaster. They do not correspond to any of the international standards, and they are held in violation of even domestic legislation. And then still contacts remain. And this is what is important. The recognition of the elections per se is an interesting abstract concept, but what we really are talking about is the recognition of the outcomes of the elections, is the acceptance of the elected leadership as the representative of the people. And I think the case of Russia stands apart in this regard, also because of the stakes involved in the current case. Russia is an aggressor state. And it is a state that is, for now, being led by Vladimir Putin in all the terrible things that it is conducting, that it is perpetuating right now. I think that the electoral process, as we see it until this moment in time, may lead to, and its legal assessment may lead to the need to not recognize the newly elected Vladimir Putin as the leader of Russia. And I think that this is the essential point here. We can be talking about we like these elections, we don't like, we recognize the process, we don't recognize the process. Ultimately, this is a political discussion of the recognition of the outcomes of these elections. And this is what matters for the foreign relations. This is what matters for the looking for the way forward. And this is why it matters, because if the international community does not recognize Vladimir Putin as the newly elected or re-elected leader of Russia, the question opens of who can be representing Russia. And that is a very fundamental question, because some of the people who want to represent Russian citizens are anti-war as well. And this is an important point in the current geopolitical, current regional and global context as well. But what would it take for some people to take an opinion to not recognize the outcomes of the elections? Obviously, this would have to be related to the qualities of these elections. And Stephanie, you've asked me to comment on the procedures. The procedures are nothing new, but much worse than before. We know that they have been defrauding the elections for years at all stages of the process, starting with the introduction of the all sorts of instruments to defraud the elections on the election day, like distance electronic voting, which is a total disaster. It simply does not work. The figures that are reported are fake figures. I've seen that play out in action. Even the people who organize this distance electronic voting through the internet, could not explain how it functions, or rather why it malfunctions constantly. Secondly, I think the whole idea of holding elections over several days is also creates ample opportunities for fraud on the election day. I could be continuing forever with these specific examples of the procedural violations, checking of signatures for possible candidates, all sorts of things at all stages of the process. But I think by focusing on the procedures, we only cover one element of the electoral process. The second extremely important element is the atmosphere in which these elections are taking place. And that is the atmosphere where fundamental rights and freedoms that are necessary for the conduct of democratic elections are simply not respected. You cannot exercise freedom of expression, association, assembly, maybe even movement and other rights in the Russian Federation now. So of what opportunities to form the will and to form a political opinion can we be speaking? I don't think it is a possibility. Thirdly, the third component, I think, is also the absence of the political alternatives in these elections. The murder of Alexei Navalny is just the tip of the iceberg. It goes beyond that. It goes to the fundamental point that the key issues of societal importance are simply not discussed, disputed, or debated in this electoral process. The war of aggression against Ukraine is not a topic in a discussion, whereas this is clearly the most important contextual factor in the current elections in the Russian Federation. I think with these three issues combined, my point and our point in the policy paper that was recently published, that these 3 points combined significantly undermine the classification of these elections as genuine elections. And this is where I add the legal dimension to what I agree with, as I said, what Olga characterized these elections as a sham. Speaking legally, these are not genuine elections. And I think that the additional factor of holding elections on temporarily occupied territories is also a violation of the electoral standards of holding elections genuinely on the principle of universal suffrage. The suffrage is artificially extended to citizens of another country. And this is a violation of standards for the democratic elections. To conclude, I think that if we find sufficient legal grounds, if the policymakers and decision makers, political decision makers, find sufficient legal grounds to not see these elections as genuine elections, this opens the door widely to the next step of not recognizing the outcomes of these elections. And I think that the case here with the Russian elections 2024 is rather clear. There is a legal justification to not recognize the outcomes of these elections. What would that entail could maybe be the subject of the continuation of our discussion today. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Alex, and to the two other speakers. So I think this first round gave a picture about several fields of reasons why these why the legitimacy is disputable. This is from electoral procedures, but also from the political background, which is the murder or the unexplained death of Navalny in prison. It is the conduct of elections on the occupied territories in Ukraine, and it is the unclear or the disputable legitimacy of the candidacy of Putin after the referendum in 2020. So there's a mixture of political background and electoral and shortcomings in the electoral procedure, which in a summary give an extent of challenges to these elections that we have not seen in the last years here in the OSCE regions, and is well ground to discuss the legitimacy as it has been done by the PA or by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and by the European Parliament. So I think this is a clear, quite a comprehensive result of our first round. To come back, Jan, you mentioned that these elections are also a political sign of Putin to the voters in the country and also to international audience, a power sign. He wants to confirm himself as a person to be able to conduct elections in occupied territories in a repressive circumstances in the own country and to stand again as a president. So our question for the next round to the speakers is, what would be the impact, what would be the consequences of an international recognition of these elections? And I start again with Olga, because I think that the consequences for Ukraine would be the most significant, but it's not only on Ukraine, it's on the whole OSCE and it's on the whole Europe. What would be consequences if there would be a recognition of these elections as legitimate? Could you maybe have a brief round on that? A short comment on that question from all of you three.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I believe that the outcome of these elections will be important not just for Ukraine, but for whole region, for Europe and for Western world. And those who accept in the international standards based on the rules which was developed after the Second World War, because it's a question about regimes, and this is a question how we can accept or reject the results of sham elections if we are going to continue the relationship with the state which has the leader which monopolize the power using the terrorization of the tools of terrorization of the nation, killing the opponents, destroying the media, and shrinking the space where there is no any rooms for NGOs, for observers, for freedoms and for rights. So we have to name this person as dictator at the end. So no space for having discussions, no space for having opponents and process which can help the nation to participate on the ruling of its own state. Without that circumstances, we can speak about the outcome of elections. We have rejected these elections and we have to name President Putin, not President Putin, but dictator Putin. I know that it's a question with many political challenges, and the challenges has many type of dimension, like how to be with diplomacy with this person or this regime, how to be with representative of this regime in other countries. But I believe that if the world will accept the result of this election, will continue mentioning that Russia is still electoral democracy, so we will have a huge problem for the future. Russia destroyed international rules. Russia destroying the justice system, international organizations. And if international groups which still are fighting for having democracies in their regions or in their own countries will accept these results and will continue to doing the business as usually, we will have the same with electoral processes and with electoral democracies all over the world, not only in Europe, unfortunately. So the practical outcome after this sham election has to be decreasing the level of relationship with this person, because he didn't take the mandate from the nation which has a space for having political decision based on international order or international standards about democracy and elections.
Thank you, Olga. You already hint to our next round, which will be on the impact of non-recognition. Now, first, we think still again about the impact of what would be the consequences of a recognition. And I want to give back this question to Jan again. You mentioned before that the non-recognition would not so much affect Putin. I would ask you maybe. I would doubt that. I would say, and very close what also Olga meant, that a recognition of his election would be also some sort of confirmation of the annexation. Would you agree on that? That it is meant, the elections are also meant as a confirmation of the annexation internally and internationally, and also on the manipulations, the legal manipulations and the manipulations on electoral procedures that have been observed. Wouldn't you think this is a point that should be assessed, Jan, in a little bit in opposition to what you have been mentioning before? Consequences of recognition of these elections.
First of all, I have to say, I study domestic Russian politics, and things I say about international relations or impacts are mostly coming from my personal capacity, not from my capacity as an expert or researcher. I think that caveat is important. Second, I would maybe try to understand what would a recognition even look like. Because a non-recognition, I understand, that might be a declaration from the European Parliament or from the United Nations in the best case, right? We don't recognize the result of this election. But a recognition, what would that actually look like? Would it just mean that states call Putin and congratulate him individually? Because otherwise, what would a recognition, a collective sort of act of recognizing these elections even look like? I would maybe give that question briefly to you, because other than that, I would hesitate to really give my opinion on this. So just doing nothing, would that mean that we recognize Putin, right? Just not issuing a non-recognition would mean we recognize that. Okay, good. I actually really think, and this might be different from the other opinions in the room, we should think about what the goals of the West and of the international community should be. And I think the goals should be getting rid of the Putin regime and stopping the war of aggression against Ukraine, and do everything that takes us closer to achieving these goals. And I don't see how an act of non-recognition can get us closer to these goals. It may, and I would agree that this is the principal better way to do it, right? It absolutely is, in terms of, the political, the moral side of things. The question is, and I think, this is just an offer to think about this pragmatically. Does it get us closer to bringing down Putin, and does it get us closer to, get Russia out of Ukraine? I wouldn't see that. And the opposite might actually be true. We can discuss that in the next round, right? But decreasing the diplomatic channels with Russia would probably be a mistake in this situation. And that not because we like Russia and we like the Russian regime, obviously not, right? Not because we think it's a democracy. And even, right, but we, of course, we have diplomatic relations with everybody. And I think it's a good thing that we do that. Not because we recognize their claim to rule, not because we think that they are rightful rulers of their country, but it's important to keep channels open, just in order to do very, very basic types of international interactions. If we close all channels, I don't think it gets us closer to ending the war and to bringing Putin down. I think, and I agree with everybody here, that it would be the moral choice. I just offer the pragmatic perspective here, and I'm open to being convinced otherwise.
Okay, interesting point. As election observers, we are used to think not about bringing down a regime, but voicing out concerns about procedures. And so I think a consequence of possible reaction should be focused not on how close it brings us to change a regime, also, but to comment and to make a point on certain changes that are happening. And I think this would be an important consequence of a non-recognition of this sort of reaction to these elections. But this is our comment to what you have been pointing out. And I think this is a very good maybe starting point for Alex to answer maybe directly on these ideas of that Jan mentioned.
Sure. I mean, I'm coming in wearing, well, not wearing any longer the hat of an international observer, but I am quite well familiar with the thinking that goes on in the heads of international election observers. And they definitely are not about propagating regime change. That is something that is the prerogative of the political actors rather than technical or legal specialists. That said, I think that, and I'm taking off my past hat of the International Election Observer, and I think that we find ourselves in a situation where it might be the opportune moment to do what is right and face the consequences. Because if we don't do what is right, we might have even more serious consequences to face. And I'll give you an extra perspective on it that I was thinking of. And I agree with Olga here that it's not just about Ukraine. It goes way beyond that. It goes even way beyond the state of electoral democracy or the role of the elections in the international relations. I think it goes to the point that we do have a situation with a permanent member of a Security Council of the UN that continues to pretend that it is an electoral democracy. There are some members of the Security Council that do not pretend they are an electoral democracy. And, that's a diversity in the world. We know that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has been endorsed by all kinds of nations, with all kinds of political regimes. But we have a permanent member of Security Council who is continuing to pretend they are an electoral democracy. Can we afford to have that? Can we afford to retain the veto power with a country that is pretending to be a democracy and is not agreeing to call itself a non-electoral regime or non-democratic regime? I think that the consequences of this could be quite drastic. And this is where we go into the discussion of the possible costs of recognition versus the possible costs of non-recognition. I think that in the current circumstances, we do have to calculate the possible risks of recognizing this sham process as a continuation of the electoral practice of bringing a government into power, from the perspective of also what this power is capable of. We have seen that they are capable of atrocities, war crimes, wars of aggression, occupying territories, violating all kinds of provisions of the international law. So I think we should not expect them to stop at this. And if we give them a recognition in the form of not giving the non-recognition, then I think we're poking the bear and we're allowing the bear to proceed. And I think that this is a very serious consideration to be made. I'm not sure what the political decision makers will be leaning towards. It is just that I think our discussion highlights again that we may want to consider the option of doing what is right and what is deeply anchored in the international law, and then facing the consequences. Because once again, if we don't do what is right, we might have even more significant consequences to face.
Thank you, Alex, for this clear position on the possible consequences of a reluctance to comment politically on the character of these elections. I think this is very important and very clear. And let's go in our third round of discussion by that. If there would be a decision And I think the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the European Parliament, have already published resolutions that they intend and that they intend to go to a non-recognition of the elections. What steps should then follow? One consequence that Jan made, non-recognition of the new president, your idea would not change the political picture. This might happen, but this is not the decisive criteria why a decision should be taken or should be taken in a different way. But important, and this is the question now to the experts, to the panelists, if this important reaction, international reactions to these shame elections will be taken. What is the set of opportunities, and what should we as civil society actors also follow up and monitor and observe how politicians implement these decisions? One thing is to declare a non-recognition either of the elections, and the second thing is how should these consequences be look like? This is a question I again start with Olga. I ask you, what is your thinking in your organizations, in your coalitions about that? What do you think would be necessary beyond the non-recognition of the elections in practical terms? How should the international community deal further with the regime in the Russian Federation?
Thank you, Stephanie. And I believe that nobody's right to spread the truth and to accept that Russia is not electoral democracy anymore, and to decrease the level of relationship with this state. So it's just hypothesis that nothing will change if everyone will speak honestly that Russia is not electoral democracy at all. The president is dictator. The regime has a transition period from authoritarian to totalitarian regime, and the outcome of this changing will continue to kill people not only in Ukraine but in other countries, because you know that Russia is going to be aggressive against their neighbors, and not only against Ukraine but against NATO countries. And this is not the fairy tales anymore, because intelligence groups in Germany, in the US, in UK and other countries publish many evidences or information from insiders that it's a process which is ongoing. So the problem is that in 2012, when Russia lost the chance to have any competition on political process, the situation was going to this hell. And we as a civil society need to accept our responsibility to continue to speak about the situation in Russia, the situation with so-called elections in Russia, and to reject these elections because it's not electoral democracy anymore. This person just monopolized the power, and Russia means Putin. So if we will continue the relationship as it was before, the situation will be even worse, because the situation will destroy this agreement after the Second World War. And not only it has connection not only with capacity of international organization, but global order will be destroyed. Yes, each of the country has its own regime, but the regime has to be honest. Is it monarchy? Is it a non-democratic regime, but the nation just accepting the situation or not? We see the revolutions or street actions against regime in Iran, for example, or in Belarus for many years ago, almost 4 years ago. But for me, it was before the full-scale invasion, and it looks like it happened a century ago. Everything is changing so quickly that our capacity or our power is to speak honestly about this transition and outcomes from this transition to other neighbors' country and to other nations. So first of all, I believe that leaders which which are presenting the democracies have not to congratulate Putin as winner of the elections. And it will be very symbolic, but it will be about the new position, political position, because before they accepted that. We don't see any sanctions from hell after the killing of the opposition in Russia. Navalny was killed, it's for sure. And just for sharing statement, it's not a solution at all after this tragical case in Russia. Before it happened with Boris Nemtsov. So we have to understand that truth is a weapon for sure. It's a weapon for the future. And the next step is about resolutions or position of parliaments. I believe it's very important because each of these organizations were brave to speak honestly about the situation in Russia, that it became dictatorship regime. Because after authoritarian, it will be a totalitarian regime, and it will be even more difficult to back to the roots. After regime of Putin will came another regime, and it will not be democratic for sure if the situation will ongoing on the same way, and if international organizations, NGOs, or international organization will accept this elections as in regular base. And as I mentioned on my first points, that it is unique stage of the history already, because President Putin with his regime changed the constitutions for having endless power. And this so-called election is happening in the first time after that change in the constitution. That's why it's not a regular thing already.
Thank you, Olga. So you will basically give an important recommendation to international community on how to use this information and how to work with the on the recognition with the in the communication field. Putin uses elections as a communication mean to say he is a leader, he is elected, and he is legitimate. International community should react on that and use these elections also mean of communication and communicating a different truth. And this is, in fact, an important point to make make new and important information about the true character of this regime. This is a very important point, and these elections are a unique opportunity for international community to discuss the true character of this regime, and therefore the election and also the election procedures play an important role. Thank you for that. We have now some questions from the chat. I think we should maybe shorten this round and look at the questions in the chat. I think Jan, there is one question which could be interesting for you as a politologist, and your view on the things. Question one: if doing the right things means non-recognition, I understand so, is the priority why it hasn't been done earlier? I think this is an important, a true question. Why would international community put the elections, the legitimacy under question now and not in 2014 when elections, 2018 presidential elections, 2021 parliamentary elections have been held already, including occupied Crimea, for instance, if this is the background of these questions. Maybe question to you on the political consequences of international behavior. Again, an international question to you, Jan, please. Are you fine with this question?
I mean, I can just give a brief statement on this to allow for more questions to be asked later. I think one important problem here is also, of course, the unity of the international community, right? And if it would be the case that there would only be like the usual suspects, like the European Union plus the US plus a few other, Western states. Japan, perhaps Australia, and the rest wouldn't do it. The question is, again, sort of from a pragmatic perspective, what would be the benefit of that? right? It wouldn't the signal that sort of the international community is disunified, and wouldn't that be the stronger signal compared to the other important signal that was mentioned before, right? Just a question I think to ponder, and I think it's not realistic that the international community would be unified on this, and yeah, I think maybe leave it at that. So you asked for the next steps also. I think that would very much depend on how, what big the percentage would be of states to go this step.
But just to your concern about unity or not unity of international community, the declaration of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe has been passed, has been accepted. The resolution in the European Parliament has been accepted with majority. So there is no signs we have not a consensus vote as in the Security Council of UNO, of United Nations. We have a majority, a strong majority in both entities, Council of Europe and European Parliament, for challenging the legitimacy of these elections. So I can just there's no concern about that point from your side. But thank you for that you comment. Let's go to next questions. We have other questions here. I think the next question, Alex, is towards you. This is question: does not the assessment of electoral procedures in Russia sort of already legitimizes these elections? I think this is a common question for election observers. Does not the pure fact of observing elections give them a credibility and a legitimacy? Alex, what is your answer to this question?
Well, I think the essence of the election observation, be it domestic or international, is exactly in the truth finding and the reporting of what is happening there in the most objective, most impartial, most technically correct manner. What happens with these findings at a later stage, when the political decision makers take certain decisions, that is more towards the political decision makers. But I think we have to realize, understand, and appreciate the fact that the political decision makers have to have solid grounds to not only take their decisions, but to also justify their decisions. You cannot expect the prime minister of a Western European nation to go out in the public and say, well, in my humble opinion, this was a sham election. And somebody will say, well, in my humble opinion, it was not. They all have to have a clear reference point. So in a way, the international election observation would provide a universally accepted benchmark for such kind of political decision making, if the politicians are able to go in this direction. Same with the citizen observation groups like Golos in Russia, like Opora in Ukraine, like many others reputable organizations. They feed into the decision makers of the political actors. And I think the issue is also whether the political actors are ready to take these inputs and take the decisions that are unorthodox, that have risks built into them. And that is where the advocacy efforts and the policy papers like we published play a significant role. And I think that this is a discussion, the focus of our discussion today, of not only what are the correct things to do, but why can these things be done, and why should they be done? And I would just repeat one simple, rather simple from my perspective point, that this case is unprecedented because of the magnificence of the Russian impact on what is happening globally. And secondly, because of us now understanding much better the true nature, true face of the Russian regime as compared to the previous occasions. And that, in a way, addresses one of the questions raised above. Why hasn't it been done before? Well, people haven't cared as much about it, that because the stakes were not as high. The stakes are extremely high right now. And I think that what we need to keep discussing is what are the stakes of maintaining the status quo. I'm returning to, the risk assessment should not extend only to what would be the risks of not recognizing the Russian elections? I think we need to keep thinking of what would be the risks of granting the legitimacy to the outcomes of the Russian elections. And those stakes, in my opinion, are extremely high.
Thank you, Alex. This is an important answer to the role of election observation, which has to be done, and one has to be refrained from being afraid that they would legitimize somehow or something. Facts have to be collected, data have to be collected, and this will be the basis for making a conclusion, making also a political decision about how to the consequences of these elections. Thank you on that point, and also on the other you raised. Additionally, there's a question. I think I would ask Olga to give an answer on that. How has the conduct of pseudo elections affected the intensity of persecution of residents in temporarily occupied territories? Are the elections already now a threat for people living there? And I think we have very sad news on that. And I think it's important, this place, that you recall that the impact, consequences of the conduct of these sham elections in the occupied territories. Olga, would you inform us on that?
Thank you for the question. Yes, there is a huge outcome of this sham election to the civilian on occupied territories, because first of all, Russians sued in this process, which was ongoing more than a week ago. So it started more than a week ago on the occupied territories of Ukraine. They are using this for checking the position of Ukrainians in their homes, because Russian military with so-called representatives of polling stations or electoral commissions started to visit each of the flats or houses of Ukrainians with these sham ballots and trying to cover them. To having the information about their political position, to having the information about their loyalty, to check the list of these people which are staying on occupied territories, because you know that those who had a chance, many of them left the territories which are already occupied by Russia because they are where. And they run many war crimes and crimes against humanity, which Russia is doing on a daily basis against Ukrainians on occupied territories. Unfortunately, this is a huge terror against Ukrainian civilians, and sham elections is just a process which is given so-called tools for Russian military and Russian servants to having these communications with Ukrainians on occupied territories. And then when the process will end, you might know that these people still don't have Russian passports or citizenship. Nobody cares about that. There is no any voter list with the names of Ukrainians which are living on occupied territories. Russians just using what they have for having picture about the process. But after this process, unfortunately, Ukrainians under the occupation will take in Russian passports, and then Ukrainians will be mobilized to Russian army. And then they will be used as a resource, as a human resource against Ukrainians. And if they will not accept this order from Russian regime, they will be killed. And that's it. Or they will be relocated from these territories to territories under the Ukrainian control without property, without money, without documents. They will be relocated because Russia doesn't need these people. I'm speaking about elder people or women if they don't have loyalty, or if they will not be used for having human resources for Russian army. So, and this is disaster because the so-called electoral process on occupied territories is giving Russians just a tool for having information about each of Ukrainians which are living there. I don't know what to say, because if you are accepting the elections in Russia, It doesn't matter what is happening on occupied territories, because occupied territories is a part of the bigger picture of the huge strategy which is happening in Europe. And when Jan mentioned the one voice of the world, I don't believe in one voice of worldwide community. It's impossible, because there is a huge diversity. We have to focus on those countries, regimes, democracies, and societies which have this, which accepted the democratic values and use it for their procedures, use them for their constitutions, use them for their daily base rights. And this is a question: if Europe will accept that, what will happen in Africa or Southern America or other continents? They will know that it's okay. So that's why I think that we are not politicians at all. According to General Declaration of Human Rights, we have a right to participate on the governing of our countries and to build democracies in it. And if we will wait the chance to have the same in our countries and to help to each other to be stronger on that topics, what we will have at the end, we will be weaker and democracies will lose historical chance, and that will be the end of the history.
Thank you, Olga, and thank you also for the question, which is important and not so much discussed, I think, before, the impact of these elections on the persons living under occupation. And if the situation is like Olga described it, and we have no doubt on that, then we see another perversion, I would say, another perversion of the idea of elections in that. But elections are used by this dictatorship, let's go, I think we can agree to call it like that, but dictatorship Russian. Elections are used to pressure people, to make them even more unfree, to make them dependent, and to force them not only to annihilate their own convictions, but make them more vulnerable to state pressure. And this is an important point. I think we should contemplate further on that. And this concerns the whole background in which we are discussing now, that we have an OSCE member state, an OSCE member state, which is not only not following the OSCE commitment, or a participating state, not only not following the commitment, but perverting them and turning them into an instrument of its own power, misuse of power. And this is something, and Olga, thank you for pointing out again to the aspect of communication, which is so important, and we very much rely on you. You are closer than anybody, and you know it so much as a Ukrainian human rights defender, what is going on. And it's our obligation, I would say, as your partners, your European partners, to take it very seriously and to use the elections, not to leave the elections as a communication tool for the authoritarian dictator country, but use it as a communication tool for those who defend elections in Europe. And therefore, I think, again, the question of legitimacy, non-legitimacy is more than a theoretical question. It's a question of political communication. Not acknowledging these elections is a very strong signal. It is legitimacy is the key idea of Putin. That's what he needs. If international audience and society would not accept that, would not follow that, this would be a harsh strike for his well-being and for the solidity of his regime. So therefore, this is also part of the political communication. I think the Parliamentary Assembly and the Parliament, the European, are have been well advised to start very early thinking about that. And it's our job as civil society, sorry for speaking longer, but civil society, election observers, to provide data, to provide information in that battlefield. It's an information battlefield. And the elections is a part in a big information and propaganda show. And our job is to contribute facts, data, and also general assessment, how this could be used and misused. Therefore, this question about legitimacy is a key question, and it's important to go deeper into that, think further. And the question about how can non-recognition, non-recognition of the elections materialize politically is important. And Alex made some recommendations in the paper we've mentioned. The harshest is not to recognize Putin as a president. And this is really doubtable because Macron has to have something to talk to. Scholz has to have something to talk to. Okay, this maybe is one aspect. It should not be excluded not to accept his presidency, but it should be put under question, absolutely. But apart from that, there are a series of different issues how non-recognition can materialize. And I think we should talk also about that. So we should come back to that question. I would give it to Alex. Maybe you can talk about these points which are still there and which we should voice out. And in the same time, we have a look at our chat and look whether there are new interesting questions for us. But first, Alex, I give you the word for forms of non-recognition of elections, non-recognitions of the presidency of Putin, but also other things which are there. Please, Alex.
Thanks, Stephanie. I think the difficulty with this question is that there is quite little in the history to refer to. And the cases that we can refer to are rather drastic and are rather sort of they are very stark in their violations of electoral norms, and typically the non-recognition of the elections does lead to the non-recognition of the leadership of a certain person of a given country. So I think this should absolutely not be excluded, and I think that the foreign leaders would need to consider the point of that you're raising as well, of the fact that they seem to want to talk to somebody. I think they do need to ask themselves a question of how often do they talk to that person now, and how effective has this talking actually been. I think Macron, who you mentioned, is a fantastic example. I think he has made quite an interesting change in the attitude since being one of the last people to be calling Putin just before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and trying to pacify Putin before all of that started. Now saying what he is saying about the possible involvement of the Western troops in the conflict, I think this is quite a significant turn of the opinion of the foreign leaders. I would not exclude, therefore, the possibility or the advocacy in favor of not recognizing Putin as the legitimately elected leader of Russia. This begs the question of what happens to the representatives of Putin. One of the very significant examples of or the outcomes of possible non-recognition of the outcomes of the election is the downgrading of the diplomatic relations. That is the withdrawal of the ambassadors. That is reciprocated quite normally by the withdrawal of the other side. The downgrade to the status of the chargé d'affaires in the diplomatic representations, possibly not nominating the replacement ambassadors because the ambassadors would have to present their credentials to the president of the country. If you don't recognize the president, there's no one to give the credentials to. Thereby, you can't actually have an ambassador sent to Russia. That is seems like a drastic option, but you have to consider that embassies survive regularly without ambassadors. Chargés d'affaires perform duties quite normally. This is a very symbolic gesture. I think the other forms of non-recognition are also the downgrade of economic relations. That is not necessarily taking shape of the sanctions regime, because sanctions regime are a different kind of a sort of track of decision-making, but the downgrading of the economic relations could happen because you can have the downgrade of economic relations with the state-owned enterprises that are run by the government or owned by the government that is now controlled by somebody who shouldn't be controlling it. And those are significant issues because the state-owned enterprises and the monopolies in Russia are magnificently present in the energy sector. And that is a big economic step to take. I'm not a huge expert on the energy politics, but I obviously recognize how drastic these moves can be. This goes way beyond the issues of potash fertilizers in Belarus, for example. Then I think the other form of non-recognition is the refusal to invite or extend the participation in the international events to Putin or his representatives. I don't think Putin is traveling far and wide these days, also because of the ICC warrant, but Mr. Lavrov is a usual attendee at certain events, and the other representatives of the Russian government could also be subject to the non-recognition by the virtue of their appointments through the non-recognized leader of the country. Then I think that the consequences are largely symbolic, but we should not underestimate the symbolism of this. It is an important thing. It is an important issue, especially if we keep remembering that the world does not stop at the Russian borders. The world does not stop at the European perimeter. Russia, as I mentioned earlier, is a Security Council member in the United Nations. Vetoing certain decisions in the current world has international, global implications. I would not stop from considering the option of not recognizing the Russian veto as legitimate in the Security Council, if that is the ambassador who is appointed by the newly non-elected president of Russia. This could be a drastic step. This is really something unorthodox to think of, but why not think of this? I'll
Thank you,
stop here.
Alex. Yeah,
I'm provocative enough, I think.
Yeah, very good, and it comes very close to a question we have in the chat. A question about the role of UN in these elections, the United Nations, not at the Security Council for sure, but in the General Assembly. The General Assembly has declared void the referenda on Crimea in 2014, immediately after the referendum, and also the referenda on the next oblasts in the eastern Ukraine in October 2023. So this is also the question in the chat about a possible role of the United Nations in these elections. And this question I would like to give to Olga: have you plans on addressing the United Nations in regard with the elections in the occupied territories? Is this a plan? Have you been discussing that, and what is your strategy?
No, we don't discuss that, because from my perspective, I don't believe that it will have any outcomes. And you may know that today our parliament adopted the statement to other parliaments. So we have to speak about that branches of power on democratic countries which can accept this warrant or information from Ukrainian parliament about challenges and issues with elections on occupied territories, and generally very low level of legitimacy of the process all over the Russia. So UN General Assembly has so many members with non-democratic countries that to have debates about democracy in Russia will be useless. And I believe that we have to be enough responsible to speak about us, to speak about our continent, first of all, if we want to have security in this region, and to promote democracy as a sustainable system which can protect itself and can prevent insecure campaigning from the dictatorship regime near our borders. So I believe that we have to be responsible and to build case study for others, because another countries which are not from this northern region of the world are looking on us. And they don't have the feeling, I believe so, because I visited Africa a few times. I had experience to organize events in Kyiv with representatives of so-called global South countries. I had many meetings in New York with official representatives of that countries. And I see how many friends we have. But we need to fight for democratic regimes in the region which accepted democracy and this type of rules. And Copenhagen's document for having is as a basic rule for building this governing system in our countries, because then they will be so disappointed because China is stronger, Russia is stronger, Iran, Northern Korea looks like a winner of this process in 21st century because they are stronger than we are. And those who are thinking what to be, how to be, with whom to be in the future, need to see responsible answer from the stakeholders in that region which accepted these rules for 100%. And I believe that there is no symbolic reactions if the biggest leaders of the world from democratic states will not congratulate President Putin as a president after these elections. It will be a huge progress already. We have a channels, not we, but you know, the regimes, the countries, the states, institutions have open corridors or open channels for communication even with terrorists. For protecting civilians, they need to communicate with those who are taking guns and fighting against the rules. But it doesn't mean that if we will not have, you know, high level of relationship with Russia, Russia will be better next year. It's not true, because the level of aggression of this regime will be increasing during next years. You will see that. That's why I'm happy that democratic leaders, that's why it's not about politicians, it's about rules and order. I'm happy that you know, leaders of EU are having very honest public position now about the perspective to help Ukraine in another manner than it was before. So we need to build this strengthening for protecting democracies, because it's about voters and it's about participation of those who have this right. And if Russia lost this chance, or Russian people lost this chance, it will be useless just to use it like a basic scenario for everyone in the future, because even in EU countries, there are different type of stakeholders or politicians or political groups which will look in on this scenario as a basic for the next 10 or 20 years. And we will lose the chance to having peace in Europe, in OSCE countries, or in PACE region, or, you know, generally in Europe. So I have to say that it's not just about braveness, it's about honest discussion that those who didn't have elections can be named as democratic elected leaders. That's it. And to spread the truth is the first step to prevent the basic scenarios for other countries, even in EU, which may have problems with potential politicians, which may use this case as you know, for their future scenarios. And I'm happy that even you know, conservative, very provocative conservative politicians in France published the same statement as President Macron. What does it mean? That even those who have another values or ideology still fighting for democracy in their countries and in this region. We have to accept that. So sharing the responsibility with other part of the world doesn't mean cutting responsibility from ourselves to protect democracy in our region.
Olga, thank you very much for this very clear statement about our responsibility, our job that we have to do, and that maybe understanding that there has to be some contact or communication with a dictator does not mean to do him the favor to call him an elected president. and that these two things should be separated, and that we have a decisive moment in Europe and in elections in Europe, and that we have a responsibility also as civil society and as experts to understand in depth what is going on, to draw consequences and to voice them to those who will take the decisions. And that is not a way to shift the responsibility to the global south or to the UN or to anybody, but to do our homework. Thank you for that. That's a very clear and important statement, Olga. And I do not see any other questions in the chat, but they have been very helpful. Thank you for the audience for your very good questions. To the point, they brought us our discussion very much further. Thank you to our three experts for giving insightful comments, and I learned from this 1.5 hours quite something, and I think it will be used and is important for our further work. I'm sure that also the political observers who attended this Zoom can take some lessons, some information from that. And I think we had a good discussion on the relationship between election observers, between election observation and the political impact, which has maybe never stood so sharp as it stands today, when tomorrow the 3 days voting will start in the Russian Federation. So I think we have a new situation on elections in Europe, a challenging situation. We must be honest that we have situations where contracts, agreements, and obligations are not followed and do not stand in a good relationship to the reality. And this is a challenge for us to find the appropriate consequences for that. I think this is a topic for further discussion. I'm looking forward to have them with you in the frame of the EPD, with our partners like ODIHR, like our other members. So thank you very much for your contribution, for the thinking together, and wish you all the best. Olga, thank you very much, Alex. Thank you, Jan. Thank you very much to the translators today in Ukrainian language and Russian language. And thank you to the organizers, helpful organizers of this discussion. So
thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie.
All the best. See you again at the next discussions. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.